Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar, this exciting webinar. My name is Eileen Spicer. The title of this webinar is How Should We Define and Measure Demand for and Use of Family Planning, New Directions and Frameworks for Family Planning Measurement. This is a follow-up webinar from one that we hosted about 3 weeks ago titled, Why Do We Measure What We Do? Reflecting on the history and current use of demand-side family planning indicators. That first webinar introduced the IUSSP panel on rethinking family planning measurement with the reproductive rights and justice lens. In that panel, through an esteemed set of speakers with varying experiences, we heard about the history of family planning measurement, considered the reproductive justice and reproductive rights framing for our measurement work, and heard from colleagues about the strengths and weaknesses of currently used indicators and recommendations for future family planning indicators that would be useful to their work. This second webinar builds off the first webinar to extend the conversation into some of the novel work being undertaken to think about future directions to define and measure demand for family planning. And we can put the link for the first webinar recording into the chat. This slide presents the steering committee for the IUSSP panel on rethinking family planning measurement with a reproductive rights and justice lens. This committee jointly developed these two webinars as our first activity. Our next activity for the group will be an expert meeting to extend these conversations. More about the expert meeting will be coming at a later date, so stay tuned for that. Just a few housekeeping issues for this webinar. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, and you can vote questions up or down or up as you choose. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please include their name as part of the question. We hope to be able to address the questions either directly in the Q&A or at the end of the session, but if time does not allow for this, we will include the questions and responses in our meeting report that will be posted to the IUSSP website at a later date. This webinar includes simultaneous translation. All of the presentations will be given in English, but you can choose the language, either French or Spanish, that you would like to listen to at the bottom of the Zoom connection through the globe icon. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the session today, Madeleine Fabic. Madeleine is currently serving as the acting deputy director of USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, and she's on detail from her role as the deputy of the Health Division in USAID's Bureau for Africa. She holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and has published widely on family planning measurement. And she previously led the management of the Demographic and Health Survey Program at USAID. She's also one of the steering committee members of this IUSSP panel that's hosting this session. Over to you, Madeleine.
Thanks, Eileen. And so I have the pleasure of introducing and later moderating the panel of our 6 esteemed panelists who I invite to come on camera for a moment. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to be speaking. First, we have Dr. Erondu. She's the co-chair of the O'Neill Institute and the Lancet Commission on Racism and Structural Discrimination in Global Health. And she's the technical director of the Global Institute for Disease Elimination in Dubai. Then we'll have Dr. Dodoo. She's the senior researcher and policy analyst at the African Institute for Development Policy, based in Malawi. And followed by Dr. Challa, who's a researcher with the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Nanda, an independent consultant based out of India. Dr. OlaOlorun, who's a senior lecturer in Reproductive Health and Family Health Unit of the Department of Community Medicine at the College of Medicine in the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And Dr. Karra, who's the Assistant Professor of Global Development Policy at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University and the Associate Director of the Human Capital Initiative at the Global Development Policy Center. You can read more about their very impressive biographies in the invitation, but for time, I'm going to keep it short and pass it to our first panelist, Dr. Erondu, please.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. And just thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate on this panel. I've been really impressed with their organization skills, and I'm honored today to share a few thoughts from an outside perspective, since I'm not in this field, but I hope that it'll be helpful to frame our thoughts and our perspective as we engage with the different topics from the forthcoming very brilliant speakers that the presentations that they will share. So I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and I've spent most of my career working on health emergencies and the control and response to epidemic-prone diseases. So I often start these types of talks with a photo of an empty mission hospital. So I don't have the photo here, so please just try to imagine this photo of a mission hospital kind of in a very rural area. And as you imagine this hospital, I want you to imagine a young doctor who has returned to this practically empty hospital, and he reflects on the villagers that he has encountered that day, as well as each previous day that week, who were bleeding and feverish, and all of them were very desperate to survive. He had seen malaria and cholera and meningitis, and now seeing his patients this week, he pondered, did what they have, was it any of those conditions, or were they none of those familiar diseases? For what seems like hours, he looks at the dried blood in the cracks of his palm, and he eventually gets up and just continues on with his day. Now, this young man would eventually persuade a very sick nun to leave that mission hospital and go with him to the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is Kinshasa, where he would be able to take a blood sample. And her blood samples would ultimately produce the first isolated Ebola virus, which would be analyzed and characterized by scientists in Belgium and the US. So I'll stop here and I'll ask, who am I describing? I'll just give a few seconds since we don't have much time. So I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll move on. And I'll give this audience some slack because this isn't a story about the pioneers of family planning. It's more from my world. And the response I normally get when I present to people in my field is that I'm speaking of Professor Piot, who is a well-known epidemiologist and leader who led UNAIDS, as well as the London School in Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And for decades, he has been credited with discovering Ebola. And I never hear of Jean-Jacques Muyembe, or Professor Muyembe as he's called, who was the one who actually bravely assessed, treated, and looked after the first known cases of Ebola with no gloves and no protective clothing. Professor Muyembe and the original team in Kinshasa are as important to the story of Ebola discovery as Professor Peter Piot, the Centers for Disease Control in the US and the Institution of Tropical Medicine in Belgium. And I tell this story because it exemplifies contribution erasure, which is one of the legacies of colonialism, and it perpetuates white framing in the advancement of scientific discovery. And this erasure and white framing substantiates the need for power and resources, as well as methodological development, to remain predominantly in white and global north spaces, because it's assumed that it's only there that there's a legacy of intellectualism and documentation. And I'm speaking to you today because the international family planning field has mostly followed this modus operandi, just like other areas, other fields across public health. And we talk about international family planning, and today we're talking about international family planning measurement. And so we must acknowledge that methodological imperialism and dominant culture definitions of success are likely driving the metrics that have been used in this space for decades. And we must also acknowledge and wrestle with the power in being part of a hegemonic group who often unilaterally or with very little meaningful inclusion develop indicators that drive priorities and influence policies and funding for people who are not in the room to make those decisions. And also we know that those who are most impacted by these decisions and the subsequent money and funding that's attached to them are Black and Brown, poor people, and marginalized people, including women, from both within high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries around the world. And so, calls for equity are a human rights-centered approach, or often, nowadays we talk a lot about decolonization. It reminds us that global health equity, as defined by global health communities, is about providing nations and communities with what they need to reach the level of good health, including mental health as they define it. But that we also have, an international definition of that as well. And I think this is what we're talking about today. We're wrestling with, how do we look at the local and the internet in the international? Because international indicators have been very important to track progress. International declarations like the Universal Human Rights Declaration has established a standard of and a baseline to keep states and other actors accountable to the steps necessary to improve lives and livelihoods. And reproductive justice must be part of that. Now, the question is, how can we ensure global level goals and metrics truly represent a collective goal while acknowledging contextual differences? And I think what can help with this is answering the question of what are these metrics supposed to do and who are they meant to influence? Dr. Shea Yambimbola, who is the editor of BMJ Global Health, he writes a lot about the foreign gaze. And this means that, we write or we develop frameworks or we measure for who we envision is engaging with our work or engaging with this data, right? So he writes about the foreign gaze, but this is in an academic context, but I think very relevant, that if the academic literature to which we give priority does not reflect the local experts who are at the forefront of addressing local problems, then there is something deeply wrong with that literature because it does not reflect reality. And he offers instead an ideal of local people writing about local issues for local audiences. Professor Agnes Benewaho from the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda, but who's also just a legend, has said that, even when partners love your country, they cannot love it more than you. And then she says that's the same about when partners are passionate about policy change. Most do not understand the social and cultural nuances that really do ensure that research is translated into policy. And so the foreign gaze can be very, very limited. And so when we're thinking about reporting indicators to assess demand side of family planning products or service delivery, what matters most in each community, I think, would be those that are demanding those services as well as providing those services. I think what's also relevant to this discussion is Fran Fanon's insertion of colonialization being inherently racist, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o's emphasis of language replacement and its inadequacy when we discuss knowledge production. This last point is really central to this discussion as we know that language shapes our thoughts and vice versa. So as you go into this discussion of rethinking measurement and how existing indicators are worded, it's important to realize that cultural assumptions underlie the metrics that we use, especially those that measure, we're going to be talking a lot, I think, about the current Family Planning 2020 partnership and the indicators associated with that, as well as the ones that are upcoming. And we must pose questions that recognize the variability of understanding when terms are used within an international context. So when I was reading the very, very good commentary on language and measurement by Eileen Spicer and colleagues, I thought, are the interventions that we're measuring, are they representative of those that really capture unmet need? And if not, are they accessible to the person that is searching for it? And I also thought about demand satisfaction and what that means to people with low means and limited choices. And if modern methods was really, good enough or even desired to some of these populations. So I'll end here and just say that, late last year, some colleagues and I published an article about developing metrics from equity. And I would be very happy to speak more about that during the question and answer session. But yeah, thanks for the time.
Thank you so much. Let's turn to our next panelist, Dr. Dodoo.
Thank you so much, Madeleine, and thank you everyone for showing up today. So I'm presenting on work that we've done in 4 countries in Africa, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, and Kenya. And what the question that we are asking really is about traditional contraceptive use and what the true prevalence and the nuances of use of traditional methods are within those 4 countries. So to start, About 80 million women worldwide are known to be users of traditional methods. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the traditional contraceptive rate is estimated to be about 3%. But in some countries, what we've been seeing is that there's been rising use of traditional methods amongst urban women, amongst more educated women in some parts. A lot of people would assume that it's women who don't have access or can't afford modern methods who would use traditional methods. But in a few countries, Ghana included, Nigeria, etc., over the last couple of maybe decade and a half or so, it's actually women, more urban, more educated women who are using traditional methods more. But in spite of that, the focus of family planning programming has been on modern methods, so much so that, for example, current survey instruments, DHS, etc., don't do a lot of justice to trying to understand traditional methods very much. And a lot of the time when we are computing our contraceptive use profiles, we end up, anyone who uses traditional methods and something else, or modern methods and a traditional method, ends up being put as a modern method user. So that's not recognized. The World Health Organization does not recognize traditional methods as we speak. And maybe I should clarify that traditional methods, when we talk about them, there are rhythm and withdrawal, which are like the biggest traditional methods that are recognized also as being effective to some extent. But then there's also herbs and all other kinds of herbs concoctions, other methods. And then there are folkloric methods. People would say, I just take a shower, or I have this string of beads around my neck that protect me, etc. But we are talking mainly here about rhythm withdrawal, which have been proven as efficacious. But the World Health Organization does not recognize traditional methods, only modern methods. And then in some countries, it's gotten even so bad that health personnel don't even get any education. If a woman goes or a man goes to say, I want to use withdrawal, or I want to use rhythm, teach me how to count my days so that I can see when I am fertile, I am not fertile. The health personnel do not get that education to be able to advise people who want that information. And so we don't know a lot about traditional method use. For example, what's the true prevalence? How many people really use traditional methods alone or concurrently with other methods, modern methods? Why do women use them? For some women, it might be because they're going from traditional to modern methods. It's a temporary thing from one modern method to another. Maybe because they don't want modern methods. A lot of people have raised concerns about hormones, etc., in a lot of modern methods, but we don't really understand that very well. And then I've mentioned concurrent use a couple of times. So some women might use a traditional and a modern method together at some points in her life, or during a certain part of the month of a cycle, but we don't know much about that. And then what we found out through our research is that sometimes it's even about different sexual partners. If, for example, a man or a woman has two sexual partners, a regular one and one who is an occasional partner or more, they might say, with my regular partner, I use this method, with A, B, C, I use this other method. And then also even the decision-making and power dynamics about choice of traditional method or methods and their use. And so that's the research that we are actually finishing up doing in these 4 countries. And I'll be sharing just the very beginning of the results that we have with you today. Okay, so our project is titled Re-examining Traditional Methods Used, Respiration or Innovation. And like I said, it's a 4-country study in these 4 countries, and it's a consortium led by the African Institute for Development Policy with partners within each country with whom we are working. The main components of the study, which actually started in 2020. So first of all, we did a methodological pilot where we're looking at how we could ask questions, question sequencing, even understanding how women and men define traditional methods, what they understand by traditional methods, etc. So there was a comprehensive time of that. And then we fielded a large survey of about 13,000 women trying to understand the prevalence of traditional contraceptive method use and who used them. And then after that, we did qualitative interviews with men and women to understand the different patterns of use, etc., and why. And so the results I'm sharing today are mainly from the large survey. And so some of the things that after our methodological pilots, we included in the survey were first the probe. So we probed for additional methods that were not spontaneously mentioned, but we probed for traditional methods first. And so we had a whole list of, in the end, there were 26 different methods or strategies. And so we asked about the traditional methods first. We have a dedicated section looking at detail on traditional method use to understand all the nuances that I mentioned earlier. And then also questions to look at switching, sequential use, concurrent use, etc., really just to understand why and how women and men use traditional methods. And then, because there's been a lot that has been said about the fact that maybe there are other pregnancy prevention strategies, so masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, use of sex toys, etc., we asked about those as well. And then finally, in our calculations of the contraceptive prevalence rate, so actually not just traditional contraceptive, but contraceptive prevalence rate, we look at not just the business as usual mode where anyone who uses a traditional method and a modern method will be counted as modern, but we have concurrent users as well, and I'll be showing that. Okay, so the survey, the large survey was collected between September 2022 and March 2023. So we are just finishing with our data cleaning. And now this is actually the first forum where we are sharing some of the full data sets. So I think it's a great plus. We worked in the 4 countries, 2 sites within each country. Ghana, Accra, Kumasi, Nigeria, Lagos, Adamawa, Kenya, Makwene, and Mombasa, and in the DRC, Kinshasa, and Mayendombe. And in the end, we have over 13,000 women. The breakdown of numbers in each country is down there. Okay, so just to share some of the results with you. First of all, the women who are using traditional methods in each of the countries are there. So ranges from 3.6% in Ghana to 14% in Nigeria. If you look at this breakdown, it's a little higher. That's what's for all women. For married women, it's a little higher over there. When we look at our probes, what we find is that probing does increase reporting of traditional method use, and it rises up the most in the DRC. And this is for both married and not married women. My final slide where I'm sharing what our results is just to show what concurrent use does. And if you look at it, there are quite a lot of women in the DRC, for example, about 1/3 of women use both traditional and modern methods. And so if we were considering concurrent use, that might be a really big thing in some countries. And so just to share this with you. And so our key takeaways is that, first of all, there was very low prevalence of other pregnancy prevention strategies. So if anyone has had that question, that was very low. I didn't share the results, but probing does increase reporting. There's a high prevalence of concurrent use, and we think that it's really important that programs, providers of family planning, look at how we can support traditional method users. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to Dr. Challa.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about person-centered and rights-based family planning and fertility measurement. So what do we mean when we say person-centered measurement? Just to sort of level set here and talk about some definitions. So when we think about outcome measurement in the family planning field, a lot of our core indicators that we've used historically, such as contraceptive uptake or contraceptive use, ultimately really prioritize pregnancy prevention, often at the risk of sort of overlooking people's individual needs, their preferences, and sometimes their reproductive autonomy as well. And I'm sure, we've all engaged in many different discussions about the gaps and critiques of these measures, which in no small part is why all of us are here today. But when we think about constructs such as unmet need, for example, this does in a way sort of try to take into account people's preferences, but it does so in more of a roundabout way without kind of explicitly asking. And this is really the gap that person-centered measures are aiming to fill. So really at its core, person-centered measurement, I think, nods to kind of prioritizing people's values and preferences across measurement programs and policies. And then at the same time, we have to think about sort of the human rights framework that advocate for focusing on the degree to which really people's autonomy and their rights are being upheld. So together, these person-centered and rights-based approaches really require us to refocus on understanding people's self-defined needs and their level of autonomy in meeting those needs. So I just want to talk a little bit today about several measure development efforts that I've had the privilege to be a part of. And first, I want to acknowledge my colleagues in the Innovations for Choice and Autonomy, or ICAN consortium. So the ICAN project is really rooted in these conceptualizations of person-centeredness that I've just talked about. And the project aims to understand how self-injectable contraception can be introduced and scaled in a way that really supports women's autonomy and decision-making. So some of the guiding questions for ICAN are on display here, but really the core of it is that we're really aiming to understand women's needs and also to measure contraceptive agency. But in starting out here and kind of in determining how to evaluate self-injectable contraception and the related programs, I think we realized, that there weren't sort of options out there that kind of comprehensively covered all of the domains that we hope to, which is why we set out to develop some new indicators. So the first indicator, the first measure that I wanted to talk about is this measure of preference-aligned fertility management, or PFM. So in proposing this PFM measure, we recognize that measuring intention, measuring decision-making is, of course, really complicated. But I think, the need for sort of more complex, nuanced measures of decision-making shouldn't sort of come at the expense of, or shouldn't preclude also using these more direct or pointed questions about what it is people want in a particular moment. So fundamentally, we've defined PFM as the degree to which people act in line with their stated preferences. And I want to acknowledge Lee Senderowitz's 2020 article, in which the importance of asking people if they want to use family planning was elevated. And so it was this that we were, trying to build on, and we thought it would be important to ask people both whether they wanted to use contraception in sort of a more general way, but also in a more method-specific way. So this PFM measure really focuses on kind of short-term intentions or current intentions. And the measure is also, as we've conceptualized it, sort of intended to be broadly applicable to many different facets of sexual and reproductive health, so including contraception, abortion, and infertility. But in this case, we're in the ICAN project, we're really focused on contraception. So you'll see in the little figure on the bottom there, calculating PFM in the ICAN study includes first gauging people's preferences. So asking if they want to be using a contraceptive method in that particular moment. And then we move on to gauging actual use. So asking folks if they are actually using a method in that moment. And then finally, we come to clarifying method-specific preferences. So among those who are using contraception, do they want to be using that particular method in that moment? So really with this measure, I think something important to keep in mind is that when we pay attention to sort of what people tell us that they want, rather than focusing solely on pregnancy prevention, we'll see that a lot of the outcomes that we've often seen on this sort of spectrum or gradient from good to bad actually kind of equalize. So just a couple of examples of possible decisions here, but what we'll see is, someone who, for example, reports wanting to prevent pregnancy by using withdrawal and does so each time that they want to, is achieving sort of as good an outcome as someone who wants to leave pregnancy up to God. So they choose not to use contraception, despite the fact that they may not report actively wanting more children. So each of these decisions, there are lots of complex reasons why these decisions may be made, and each one may not necessarily reflect complete agency in a person's ability to sort of make decisions for themselves. But I think implicit in our measure of PFM is really a shift away from judging these individual decisions and characterizing them as sort of reflecting need, but really instead privileging individually defined needs. So when we were developing the PFM measure, I think what we were looking for was sort of a more simple alternative outcome measure, but shifting into thinking about the construct of contraceptive agency, which is our second measurement innovation as part of the ICAN project. But when we started thinking about sort of more complex constructs like agency, for example, we felt it important to go back to the existing literature, drawing particularly from existing measures and frameworks that have focused on person-centered measurement, acknowledging, lots of this conversation is ongoing and people have been sort of thinking about these issues for some time. But in reviewing a lot of the existing measures and frameworks, we found some key areas where we felt there was room for innovation with a new measure of agency. So these include, first, shifting away from equating contraceptive use and specifically overt contraceptive use with empowerment. And then we thought there was space to sort of innovate on understanding the extent to which people are aware of their rights and societal injustices, incorporating various sources of interference and support beyond a partner, and then making our measures sort of more broadly applicable. So I'll just quickly say, in our attempts to sort of innovate in this area, we defined the ICAN measure of contraceptive agency as this sort of two-domain construct. So agency in contraceptive decision-making, which is more about kind of the internal decision-making process. And then we had agency in acting on contraceptive decisions. So that's more about the external action-oriented process. And we've gone through a lot of this measure development process so far in parallel in studies in Nigeria and Uganda. And we're currently adapting the measure as well to the US context. But we have our psychometric evaluation underway at the moment. So just to wrap up, these are just a few of the ways that we've tried to innovate in the ICAN project, and we recognize, there are a lot of different efforts and conversations underway, and we're appreciative of the opportunity to share in this forum. So looking forward to presenting more data-driven results from our two new measures in the near future and opportunities to collaborate on implementing them as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now it is Dr. Nanda's turn.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Eileen and Elizabeth and IUSSP for inviting me on this panel. I'm going to actually reflect on some of the work that I did with partners in India, more as an investment maker. I was at the Gates Foundation, and this was a part of an investment where me and some of our partners, part of what we call the Family Planning Measurement Learning and Evaluation Consortium, were working. It was a 5-partner consortium, and this work that I'm going to reflect on, the measures work, was led by the Center on Gender Equity and Health, Anita Raj and Nandita Bhan, who've written a lot on some of this work now. So today I'm going to just reflect on what we did with some of the measures work and why were we doing that, and just some implications or reflections from that. Basically the premise that really for us, as you know, the Gates Foundation is funding and supporting a lot of work on family planning programs in two of the largest populous states in the country, UP and Bihar. And for a long time, there was very little traction on MCPR. And it's only in between the last two NFHS surveys that we've seen this big increase, or relatively big increase, in MCPR, which was also accompanied by an increase in traditional method use. So increase in reversible method use, as well as traditional method use. And the prior surveys, the measures that were being used for agency were the very traditional DHS measures, and they had no traction on use. So the decision-making measures basically had no signal. And because of that, there was no motivation for the program to really start looking at some of the gender and power issues on the demand sides that women have to face in negotiating contraceptive use. So this became a big struggle, that because the data is not, the evidence is not reflecting this, therefore the program also is kind of in this limbo, in not knowing what to do. So the premise was to really kind of start unpacking and disrupting that. So from our perspective, there was broadly, globally, as we all recognize, there is a lack of clear conceptual understanding and consensus on how women's agency is defined and measured. So that's where we also started the work, and lack of consistent understanding of how that influences use and intention to use, both the extent and how actually that happens. And where it's been defined, its reliance is mostly in what gets captured in DHS. So what we were starting with was that the field-based knowledge and measurements and insights were quite limited. And then there was the missing symbiotic connection and understanding between what the researchers are finding or doing and what the implementers know and work on and recognize as important. And basically, neither researchers nor implementers fully understand not only reproductive agency decision-making, but also what women choose to disclose in these surveys, what they conform to, what do they not conform to, and in sense, therefore, what is agency in that context? For example, as I said, our questions was, does non-use, traditional method use also connote agency? So this is where we started the work. And the grant to Center on Gender Equity in Health really was to look at the role of gender measures in predicting contraceptive use and demonstrating its relevance for programs. And they were working in a consortium of partners in UP and Bihar that included CARE, IHAT, Population Council, and International Center for Research on Women. And their reviews are online on their website. So I'm going to very rapidly just go through them very quickly. What I think they did a very thorough landscaping exercise to look at what are the measures on gender and agency that predict for family planning that have been used to look at contraceptive use and range of related outcomes. And they found that of the 33 measures that were scanned, 66 were provided good psychometric data and had been tested in more than one LMIC. So, it wasn't that there was an extensive availability of measures, good measures that had been tested in many LMICs, and 31 strong, rigorous measures that could be integrated currently in field surveys that should be harmonized in cross-national studies. So they're ready for harmonization. And then 39 promising measures. And most of the good measures were, they used the SCAN, do, act and resist framing for empowerment. And most of the good measures were in the CAN or the self-efficacy space, and somewhat in the ACT space, which is much more about discussion and communication, but the resist space, to really resist norms, to accommodate and understand how sanctions might affect decision making. That space, there was very little that was available. And so the reviews are available. I would encourage you to go and look at them. But I'm just going to very quickly talk about a few examples before I get to the bigger points I want to make. So these are the measures that were tested in these two large ongoing surveys. So our partners, the UP and Bihar partners, were doing programs, and there was evaluations of these programs. So the surveys were designed, there were these large DHS type surveys that were designed to evaluate the programs. And these measures, the ones that were promising, were embedded in these surveys. And these are the measures that were tested: family planning, self-efficacy, spousal communication, balance of power, social norms related to family planning, household and family planning decision-making, violence, mobility, and interpersonal quality of family planning. And I've just shown you the sample size. So it's a fairly rigorous, testing of these measures in the context of these two states. But there were many challenges. Firstly, as many of us know, last few years of work was, we all had to encounter COVID. And so our work proceeded in the midst of COVID. So there was a lot of resistance actually from partners because we were actually asking for more real estate in an already fairly extensive survey, which has to evaluate a program. And sometimes, I mean, it really was a negotiation between researchers who were embedded in programs and the center that's role was to really test and embed measures, was from the perspective perhaps of field surveyors or even the research organizations, initially lack of conviction that these are important in the surveys that they were executing. And part of that was really lack of space and time, and also having to navigate large surveys in the context of COVID. There were also genuine problems in translation and adaptation of key constructs. So, it's again, the cross-contextual adaptation. There were many, many times that each item had to be reiterated, and we had to really look at the Hindi translation and discussed actually a lot and negotiated a lot. For example, perhaps, a measure on social norms from an African context may have included the role of religious leaders, which didn't make sense in the Indian context. So that's just a small example of the kind of very minutiae adaptation and discussion that took place in developing and refining the tools. What they did find a few examples just quickly. So this is the CAN Act and Resist framework. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of measures. So self-efficacy was kind of clustered in, was broken into two domains. One was to discuss family planning and to use family planning. And it was predictive of higher spousal communication, modern contraceptive use, reversible method use, and traditional method use. And actually the self-efficacy to discuss family planning had greater odds than self-efficacy to use family planning, which was interesting. And then the balance of power, which was another measure that was tested, also was found, which basically includes items around who has more say in decision making, who gets their way if there's a disagreement, whether you can talk openly about sex. That was also associated with marital relationship equity, spacing method use, and traditional method use. And these are important because what it's telling us that these measures, beyond influencing contraceptive use, they also affect some of the relationship and positive relationship dynamics that we think we believe could be really important proximate determinants of use in the future. And these are points that have also been made by some of the other panelists, as well as the first session. Similarly, the fertility norm scales was tested. And again, women who reported internalizing and facing greater restrictive norms were more likely to report trying to get pregnant, being unsure on delaying pregnancy and birth intervals. And, so I think basically all of these measures were actually giving us a signal that they are important, and they're predicting some of the important gender dynamics that we believe need to be unpacked and understood as we are thinking of designing our programs to address women's reproductive health needs. So because time is short, I'm just going to summarize for me what's important here. One is, what is this evidence telling us? So we tested a whole host of measures. It's telling us that gender and power dynamics in relationships have deep meanings, and they to date have not been fully captured by a few select measures that we've been typically using. Also, what we know from these panels and in the last maybe 4 to 5 years, that the field of measurement is rapidly evolving and throwing up new challenges. It is progressive, transformative, the measurement field, but also it's throwing up challenges of what's being excluded and not measured still, and does not have cross-cultural validity. So it's also bringing up the fact that now we have a host of new measures, but we also need to consolidate and harmonize. And would that again mean collapsing or risk of essentializing these very complex frameworks and measures when it has taken us so long to get here? So this is kind of, for me, a predicament. Then what is this? How do you understand or infer the evidence? What does it tell you about reproductive and sexual journeys? So again, the challenge is lacking that kind of longitudinal data, which is difficult in most settings. Reproductive autonomy or agent self-efficacy at one point may not have the same effect later in time. And age and tenure of a relationship aside, it's also the changing nature of relationships that include changing intimacy, shifting power. So I think we again need to have a better understanding of how even these measures that are predicting contraceptive use today, how these themselves are dynamic and changing within the context of relationships that are changing. Then agency has obviously a non-linear relationship with power asymmetries in the family, in the community, in the intimacy of a couple. So we need to also do a little more unpacking that, what does reproductive agency mean in the context of a woman who faces extreme violence or really lacks informed choice or full choice? What does covert use mean? Is it an indication of agency or is it an indication of lack of agency? It does depend on whether the experiences are of extreme coercion and violence or not. So again, there is lots more that we need to do in terms of understanding this evidence. And lastly, the sexuality and gender identities, meaning of reproduction and marriage is changing today. In reproduction, surrogacy is a big theme, at least in the case of India. It's led to a lot of important scholarship. So again, how do we understand some of these when we go and collect data? There is, do we really understand, do the surveys and the measures really pick up the nuances of implied and hidden meanings?
Dr. Nanda, I'm going to have to stop you there.
Okay.
I definitely wanted you to get to that final point, and I'm glad that you did, but I'm sorry we have such limited time, and hopefully you can elaborate further in discussion.
Can I just say one line at the end? I just want to say all of this really means for us is that we need to have much more extensive dialogues with implementers, because programs need to change in response to the evidence. So this field has to really influence programs. And I hope in the questions I can address some of the other points.
Thank you. And over now to Dr. OlaOlorun.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be able to share my reflections on measurement of family planning and fertility with a couple perspective. I'll start with a quick introduction, and then I'll remind us of some of the many excellent points that were made in the first webinar that are relevant to my presentation. Then I'll make 4 points. First, it takes two to tango. 2, context matters when thinking about measures. 3, measures obtained from mixed methods will improve our understanding of fertility and family planning. And 4, There are challenges in obtaining couple measures. Traditionally, family planning and fertility measures have been derived from women and make assumptions that women or couples want to have children and that they make conscious choices regarding their fertility behavior. We know that this isn't always true. Even though information is often obtained from the woman, it's often used and interpreted as if it's obtained from the couple. Also, the commonly used measures do not even reflect the preferences and health of women or couples, but the interest of researchers and program personnel. While total fertility rate, contraceptive prevalence, unmet need for family planning, and demand satisfied are important indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals and for FP 2030 and several other programs, how do they reflect what individuals and couples really want? Perhaps we need to track more measures that reflect the reproductive health services received and that are focused on improving the health of individuals, couples, and communities. We need to clearly articulate what we're measuring, who we're obtaining the data from, our audience, and what the data will be used for. And all of these important points came up in the first panel, in the first webinar. So this panel is addressing the compelling critiques that call for more clear terms and correct interpretation of existing measures of family planning and fertility demand, as well as the development of new measures that take into account reproductive justice and rights, a person-centered perspective. But also we need to think about the perspective of couples and think about couple-centered perspectives, because this information is critical to family planning programming. While existing measures are still useful, the only thing that is constant is change. The existing body of research suggests that when men and women are matched as couples in survey data, there's often disagreement in their report of desired fertility and contraceptive use, and several seminal papers address this. While we have a lot of research on unmet need for family planning among women, using both the older as well as the more recent definitions for unmet need, we need to do much more to measure unmet need for couples. After all, it takes two to tango. There's research that suggests that we may be overestimating couples' concordant unmet need for family planning when we base our measures on women's fertility intentions. In thinking about unmet need for couples, we must not forget the complexity that polygyny introduces. There are important contextual factors that need to be taken into account when defining, collecting, and interpreting indicators. Community norms are probably best obtained using mixed methods, as qualitative methods will add the depth that quantitative methods lack. And they may also provide data to define and then test new measures to garner community perspectives. Fertility and family planning related preferences and practices are known to vary by region or subnational units. And patriarchal settings are very different than more egalitarian settings. These are all contextual issues that we must keep in mind as we reflect on the individual, couple, and community fertility and family planning measures that we have, and consider tweaking these as well as developing new measures. For couples, there's a lot of nuance to unpack with existing and potential family planning fertility measures. Use of qualitative methods will help to improve our understanding of what we're measuring and what we may be missing with our current measures. I find a quote attributed to Albert Einstein quite instructive. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Some researchers have used qualitative methods. They've used participant observation, in-depth interviews, focus group discussions in order to catch a glimpse into couple dynamics and better understand the context with regard to family planning and fertility. Family planning researchers can also use methods like cognitive interviewing to evaluate existing and proposed new survey questions. There are a few challenges that exist. Reproductive health services in many geographies are oriented toward women. In order to encourage men to accompany their partners or to come to seek services themselves, these services need to be made more couple-friendly. Perhaps we need to start measuring how couple-friendly reproductive health services in health facilities are. In sub-Saharan Africa, existing research shows improved contraceptive uptake and more consistent use when women have the support of their partner. Men are the traditional breadwinners, and they tend to be away from home for long hours. A man is often difficult to pin down to administer a survey to. From my experience in Nigeria, in order to obtain data from couples, we need very flexible work hours. I raise this issue because even when we do have measures that we think work well as a community of practice, we have to be able to field the surveys. Perhaps there will be a lot to learn from asking about interview preferences for men. Gender-matched interviews and proper community entry that enables men to know that your survey is on and that you're coming even before you knock on their doors has worked well for me in my work. As researchers, especially for representative national surveys, we need to ensure that our voices are heard, such that the wording of fertility and family planning questions are the same for men and women. This will enable us to have a better outcome when we're trying to match couples and trying to look at the agreement or disagreement or whatever newer measures that we're interested in. To sum up, existing measures are still very useful, but additional new measures are needed that take into account all of the perspectives that this panel is shining the light on, both from the previous webinar as well as from this webinar. We need measures that reflect contraceptive autonomy, that are person-centered, and also measures that are couple-centered. We need measures that take the context into account, especially community perspectives, as these can influence perception of, access to, and use of reproductive health services. We need to learn from mixed methods research, as well as using a reproductive justice and rights lens to reassess existing measures and potentially conceptualize new measures. This IUSSP panel provides an excellent opportunity to discuss these issues further, and I'm excited about what's next. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. And now to our final panelist, Dr. Karra.
So thank you for this really great opportunity to follow on the shoulders of giants. And I think a lot of my points are going to echo what has been heard in the panel today, as well as from the previous webinar. My discussion today will be about measurements and family planning with existing data. And I'm going to share a couple of examples and some thoughts that I've been working on. And also to maybe end with some poignant questions and critiques, as well as to open up the floor for questions and how we rethink family planning measurement more broadly. I don't think it's any surprise, and given the context and the discussion to date, that it's clear that measurement sets the agenda. What we choose to measure, what we choose not to measure, really has broad implications, not only for research, but for policy, practice, and programs. And I think it's important to highlight again that different measures have different purposes. Like there are measures that capture individual level outcomes versus population level outcomes, and we often in the field confound the two. Just as a clear reminder, unmet need as a population level prevalence measures a population level outcome, but it often is misattributed to individual level behaviors. There are measures that are important for assessing program level performance, but often get attributed to individual level behavior again. And then there are also measures that are intended for prioritizing resources and funding. I think that in family planning, if we look back over the past few decades, that we have made considerable advances in program design, thinking about evaluation, like how we can use evidence bases for advocacy and scale up. But I think that we have not done as good of a job until more recently in the field of measurement. I think one of the reasons for that is that the data sources that we often tend to rely on and the conceptual approaches to measurement, which often are reflective of the data that is available, are largely unchanged. Just a couple of examples from some of my own work. And both of these examples are open access and available. So actually I've put the QR code for anybody who's interested in accessing and learning more about this work. One measure that came out that I've been working on in the special issue of Studies in Family Planning earlier this year was unwanted family planning. I think there's been some discussion in the previous panelists who were thinking about contraceptive autonomy, who were thinking about what is discordance truly look like between what women want or what they say they want and what they actually do. And a lot of discussion has been coming up in these two panels around unmet need. Now, unmet need measures one type of discordance, but there's the other type of discordance, which is women who want to have a child, but who are using contraception. And unmet need is literally the complement of that concept. But that complement has not been assessed or measured to date. So David Canning and I have proposed a measure using the exact same data from the DHS that one would use for calculating unmet need to calculate this estimate of unwanted family planning for women who say that they have an intention of wanting a child soon or as soon as possible, but who are using contraception. Now, because we use that same data, we end up with the same limitations and issues that unmet need has and the same critiques that unmet need has, which is that we are mapping stated preferences to outcomes related to contraceptive use or non-use. We do not have data on women who express uncertainty in their preferences or how to code them. We do not have measures of fertility preferences or intentions for women who are never asked, especially women who are sterilized. This is actually the global distribution of our measure of unwanted family planning, and it ranges from about 0.4% in the Gambia to about 7.1% prevalence of unwanted family planning in Jordan. A second measure that we've been working on is thinking about unmet need and rethinking unmet need from an alternative perspective. And the motivation for this approach, using the same demographic and health survey data to be consistent, at least with data availability, is motivated by Sarah Bradley and John Casterline's 2014 piece on unmet need. And in that paper, something that really struck me as that they mentioned was, what would contraceptive prevalence, if that is the measure of, or the indicator of interest, what would contraceptive prevalence look like in a perfectly contracepting society? And we define perfectly contracepting societies as those societies where women and couples have contraceptive and reproductive autonomy and are empowered to make choices, whether to use, whether to not use, and if so, to use the method of their choice. And in that world, if we can measure contraceptive prevalence, how is that contraceptive prevalence and that estimate different from the current status quo? If we really think about as the measure, the difference between those two worlds, the worlds where we see or are able to estimate ideal contraceptive prevalence and the contraceptive prevalence in the status quo, that difference is unmet need. And so I actually provide in this paper I propose an approach to estimate ideal contraceptive prevalence and by extension unmet need by identifying a subsample of ideal women whose characteristics and environments across the different surveys that we have in the demographic and health surveys, how those women may more closely reflect contraceptive and reproductive empowerment. And the advantage of this approach is that it only requires about 6 to 8 commonly used survey items that are measured not only in the DHS, but in most common surveys. So with these two examples, I wanted to quickly reflect a bit about some of the thoughts that went into their development, but also some of the critiques and the limitations that we face when coming up with these types of measures. There's ongoing tensions in measurement. I think there are lots of debates that are being had currently, especially over the past couple of years, about what is ideal in measurement versus what is feasible, what we can feasibly measure, the differences and the nuances between measuring program-centered measures versus person-centered measures and the purposes that they serve and for whom they are intended. And I think it's also an important distinction to be made about how we should change, like in thinking about measurement development, how we change existing approaches to measurement versus how we reinterpret measures with the data that we already have. And I think that like, in thinking about a few points, like a few takeaways that I would have is that there is definitely a need for new data and approaches to measurement. I think that something that is really important, particularly from the recent work on contraceptive autonomy and contraceptive empowerment, is the ability for us to be able to successfully disentangle contraceptive preferences and contraceptive intentions from fertility preferences and fertility behavior. And I will show in a slide, in the next slide, some evidence for this that motivates this rationale from my work in Malawi. I think it's really, really important for us to start moving beyond the cross-section and thinking about longitudinal evidence where we follow people over time with panel data. And I think one of the things which highlights this is that there's a real mismatch between static and dynamic preferences where people change their mind, they are entitled and have the right to change their mind. And this is where we end up with these real discordances by observing data on what women say they want and what couples say they want versus what they actually do. So there's distinction between stated preferences for contraception versus what they reveal preferences in terms of contraceptive behavior. I think that there are lots of calls even within this panel and within this webinar on thinking about person-centered approaches to measurement. I think while conceptually this has a lot of appeal and requires further attention, I think operationalizing what person-centered approaches to measurement means is the next challenge, and it almost surely requires new data to do so. So existing data sources are almost certainly unlikely to be able to meet this goal. And I think it's important, I think Priya and Nanda had a point about thinking about multidisciplinarity and thinking about walking the walk when taking multidisciplinary, multi-method approaches to measurement. Really quick, I just wanted to share this transition matrix on what it looks like in Malawi. We measured women at 4 different time points, at baseline, counseling, and follow-up. And at the top matrix, we see that about 40% of women are changing what they say is their stated ideal method over time. In the bottom matrix, however, we only see about 20% of women, 18 to 20% of women actually changing their use. And by the way, this also includes non-use. Something to highlight from these 2 matrices is that these 4 time points were measured only over a 2-month period. So you can see that about 40 to 50% of women are actively changing what they say they want over a very short period of time. And that's not reflected in our static measures and cross-sectional data with DHS. I think that just to conclude, I think it's important for us to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Clearly, by saying this is the best that we currently have in our existing measures is not good enough, and neither is this is what we already have used. And I think that what's a challenge and a risk that we have as a field is that measures from existing data sources that have become standards or that we hold as standards are at very high risk of overinterpretation, where there are many instances where the same question or the same observable measure is interpreted as latently in many, many different ways. And that's a challenge and a problem in the field. But I also want to caution the field by saying that innovations come at a significant cost, and the value added of new innovation is also uncertain. Yes, with new data collection approaches, with new innovations in data collection measurement, with electronic surveys, for example, yes, there are some costs of measurement that have been reduced, but also there's a challenge of risk of innovation for the sake of innovation without sufficient scrutiny and reflection, and also consensus and assessment of the implications from the field. So I think there was a point that was made in both seminars, which is with limited resources, and this is the economist in me speaking, what are we willing to trade off? Like if we have to measure something, or if we're adding new measures in surveys, what do we have to give up? And I would like to bring this within the broader context of like a nationally representative survey like the demographic and health surveys. Family planning is only one specific module in a much broader compendium of data that is collected as part of that effort. So if we're asking to add survey questions for the sake of new measurement in this field, then are we willing to talk to other fields in maternal child health and HIV to say, can you give up some space so that family planning can have more of a measurement agenda within that measurement exercise? So with that, I will stop. And I'm going to make one final plug to the special issue on studies in family planning, which came out in March 2023. It is 16 amazing papers all around measurement on sexual reproductive health and rights, trying to think about new conceptualizations as well as operationalizing new measures. I highly recommend that the audience engage with this literature, and I think there are going to be many, many new discussions and ongoing discussions to be had on these topics. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So I am going to take a moment in my role as discussant to try to pull together the different threads that were presented today. And this slide represents really just a snapshot of what we've heard from our 6 fantastic panelists. But I hope that this overly simplistic snapshot, in it, you'll see some of the commonalities that I see and hear across these 6 different presentations. And they're ordered in a slightly different way than they were presented today, but they do start with our first presenter. We heard from Dr. Erondu that our sector and the larger global health field needs metrics that are rooted in equity versus metrics that report on equity. And I think for Dr. Nanda, this call to action really speaks to our need to redefine our sector goals in a way that prioritizes women's reproductive choice rather than contraceptive use. Dr. Challa then further drilled down on this idea, highlighting the importance of person-centeredness, and that means that we need to be prioritizing a person's self-defined needs and preferences. And in her study on traditional method use, Dr. Dodoo gives us an example of how current measurement frameworks ignore or even problematize a behavior that is for some individuals a reflection of their preference. And her work then highlights the problems that come when we do not take a person-centered approach to programming and to measurement. Meanwhile, Dr. OlaOlorun reminds us that a person-centered approach may also be too restrictive, especially when, as she says, it takes 2 to tango. And her work suggests that we must also be considering the needs of the couple as a unit, bringing forward the idea of coupled centeredness in addition to person-centeredness. And finally, as we just heard from Dr. Karra, he offers that another challenge that we need to consider in our various approaches to measurement is what a person says and what a person does is often misaligned. So how do we disentangle the apparent mismatch, including the mismatch between contraceptive preferences and fertility preferences, particularly if we were going to be taking a person-centered and/or couple-centered approach? So clearly there's a lot of shared interest in moving the field forward that respects and represents an individual and all of their diversity in a way that does not frame contraceptive uptake as the measure of success. And there's a lot of diversity and thought about how we get to this shared vision of metrics rooted in equity, representative of the people that we aim to support, taking this rights and justice lens. And with that, I'm going to stop presenting, and I'm happy to say that we have a few minutes for question and answer. So I appreciate that folks have been asking questions as we've been going, and I know that our panelists have been responding. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that came through the panel, from the panel presentations, but also from some of the Q&A as well. And the first that I'll start with is, what do you think the benefits and challenges are of measuring preferences, whether they be individual preferences or couple preferences, or maybe even community preferences? And the second is, reflecting on Mahesh's last point and a question that Dr. Brenner asked in the chat, what are we willing to leave behind in order to move forward? And do you all have some thoughts in that space? I will just turn it to the panelists. If I need to start pointing out different folks, I will, but I see that Dr. Nanda, Priya is off mute, so maybe she wants to kick us off.
I am going to reflect on the second question, Madeleine, because I think that that's really the big predicament, right? My fear is that we cannot deliver on the many asks that we have, and we really need to go through some kind of a consensus on data reduction before we say we need, and a consensus on really what are the essential measures. Because when I look at a list that emerged landscaping shows, there are, for any one construct now, there are multiple measures. And we're going on refining our questions and nuancing this more. So I think, like Kerry had asked this question, and I would say, you know, DHS should really go through this large macro cross-national consolidation and reduction exercise to see what's the data that is not being used. And then Mahesh had talked about, you know, why we collect certain kinds of data. The survey is not the space to collect all of the data about program performance. And this is what's happening, you know, even when you sit in meetings where the government and all the different departments of the government are trying to negotiate, everybody wants their program performance data in the NFHS/DHS. That's not the place. So I think we need to go back to the basics and saying what is the right platform for what kind of data. And maybe we need very specific kind of longitudinal surveys for some short period of time to really try and understand this whole set of issues around, you know, relationship dynamics, power, decision-making, all the things that we're talking about. And once we have a very good idea about this, then maybe the frequency of this could be reduced. I mean, these are just some thoughts and reflections, because I think otherwise the surveys might be doing a very bad job of collecting a whole lot of data. I think Mahesh also made that point, which is not useful to the program.
I guess maybe I should just follow on what Priya was saying, which is, I mean, maybe I'm better at asking the questions than answering them. So but I think in that spirit, I think one of the challenges that we actually have to reconcile and grapple with is our understanding. I mean, I think at the root of so much of this debate and discussion is, what do we mean by preferences? How do we actually articulate them? How do we actually observe and operationalize them? And I think that our field has struggled with this in our measurement because we often rely on the same types of surveys that are cross-sectional and that actually we're trying to understand dynamics. We're trying to understand or infer changes over time. But when you have cross-sectional data that is just not conducive for that type of measurement, then we really will be second or third best. And we actually don't even know we actually are not even sure of what the ideal measure would look like, even if it were like presented to us in front of us. Like my presentation of that transition matrix, where we're just looking at only 2 months of time, and the fact that so many women justifiably and very rationally are changing their minds, and what we would call changes in stated preferences, should give us all in the field a reason for pause to say, what are we actually then measuring in these large-scale cross-sectional national representative surveys when we're saying, oh, this is a person's fertility preference, this is a person's contraceptive preference. And I think, Madeleine, like, we've had some discussions about how the field outside of the academy, I feel that we often use synonyms of words or words that are maybe reflective of the same underlying construct, but they're all using the same measure. Like I'm still, I think, outside of family planning, reproductive health, like measuring a belief versus a preference versus a desire versus a need versus an intention. I don't think anybody outside of family planning, reproductive health would really find serious distinction in them unless you're unless we are clear about how they are measured distinctly. And I don't think that the field is clear about how we measure those different constructs distinctly. So I will stop there.
I think Mahesh has definitely talked about many of the challenges, and indeed there are many challenges in measuring preferences. But once we're able to talk through these challenges as a family planning community, I think that at the end of the day, we will find that understanding preferences will give us new insight into what the end users need and what they want. Because we're obtaining information from women, from men, from couples, from communities, but then what do they get in return? Perhaps understanding their preferences will help us to better understand how we should be rolling out programs, what research we should be doing, what policies we should be tweaking or developing. It will give us new insight that I don't think we currently have. We'll just have to find out.
I really appreciate that point that you're making is what do they get in return? And again, how are we responding to communities, couples, individuals, stated needs? And this, I think, is maybe a good segue to a question that I wanted to ask Ngozi, which is in a conversation that we were having via email, you were talking a lot of, well, you had mentioned that we need to focus on metrics that are rooted in equity versus metrics that report on equity. And I was reflecting on that, and I was saying, it's easy for me to think about measures that report on equity, but I think the former, the metrics that are rooted in equity is more thoughtful and maybe more elusive for me to really deeply understand, and recognizing that you've been thinking about it, working on it. You just published the paper in the Lancet. I was curious to know what are some of those measures, and what does that type of a framework look like maybe for the family planning field?
Yeah, thanks, Madeleine. Well, just to say, all the speakers, I think I was, for being someone outside the field, I've learned a lot today, and very pleased to see people really interrogating the status quo and looking at how to be more inclusive and kind of root things in indigenous or traditional ways of existence. And I think, we always talk about like the process. You can't have like equitable outcome if you don't have like an equitable process. And so it's really about like who's developing those indicators and like who's included and who's part of the process when kind of these discussions of measurement come up. I think, so for example, the study that Dr. Dodoo showed today or presented today, I think is it was really insightful about the probing. And, I am Nigerian American, but I'm married to a Zimbabwean. And we always talk a lot about like high context and low context, and Americans are very low context. So you really have to say things quite directly for, Americans to really process something, whereas Zimbabweans, and often it's not a general theme, but a lot of African communities are really high context with a lot of things, like things said directly aren't usually very well, received. And so you really kind of have to read what's going on beyond what's said to understand something. And so when she was presenting that, the study, I just thought about how it's so important to like sit with things. And, when you're in different contexts and different cultures, the way you process and understand something that, even Dr. Mahesh just talked about, like all these nuances that are super academic in some ways. What does that translate to when it comes to the actual person or communities that you are measuring? And I think that's just really important to interrogate. And just to say, I didn't present kind of like the processes and the recommendations that we put forward in that paper. But I think, part of it is really ensuring that the starting point, that you're not just sitting and saying, okay, there's this big outcry for equity and we need to be more inclusive. It's about steeping your institution, your policies and practices in this, kind of search for equity. And that starts with like defining really clear principles about why you're doing something. And another kind of recommendation that we had was that equity metrics have to be nuanced. It should capture intersectional identities. And it's really important to kind of make sure that they don't mask privilege, because there's different levels of privilege throughout our societies. And then we talk about like metrics being able to capture both actions as well as results. And then, I think this is kind of standard for evaluation, but just it's really important. Like a lot of times in public health, we only look at inputs or outputs and not really look at the results aligned to that. So that was our third recommendation. And the fourth one was that you can glean a lot from kind of measurement improvements to help inform equity, but they're not the same. So health improvements, sorry, to inform equity metrics, but they're not the same. So looking at just health outcomes is not the same as measuring kind of the equity of the delivery of service, or the equity when it comes to like the populations reached or the indicators that have been developed. So understanding that distinction is really important. So thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. I have so many more questions, and there are some great questions that are still unaddressed in the Q&A. We will get those questions to the panelists and get responses back to folks, including then in our summary report, I believe. With that, I'm going to pass it to Eileen, who's going to close us out.
Yeah, so thank you. I just wanted to, first of all, of course, thank all the speakers. And I was hoping to share this screen, which I'm not sure. Can you see the Brisbane? Can you? Okay. So I wanted to thank all the speakers. That you did excellent presentations and moving this conversation forward. I wanted to remind everybody about the expert meeting that's going to happen. There will be a call for papers for that, and we look forward to engaging the broader community on that. I also want to acknowledge that there's many measurement conversations that are happening. This is just one, and there's others, and we're looking forward to working with those groups and hearing what they have to contribute to that conversation, including, as Mahesh mentioned, Studies in Family Planning is engaging in this conversation. So keep an eye out potentially for activities or ways that they'll be involved. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the IUSSP 30th International Population Conference. They're our host here. And so it will be in Brisbane. And we look forward to sharing what we've learned at that conference, but we hope that others will participate in that. And with that, I want to thank everybody, and it's been great. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining.